a CRG series in the Corona times. 6 lectures on migrants and refugees. In collaboration with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, South Asia, and Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna. The COVID-19 pandemic has ushered in an era which, even without it, appeared as building on its inheritance of displacement, discrimination, and disparity. Yet, ours is also an era which inherited the idea that empathy isn't alien to law, politics, or to any field of knowledge or activity. That in certain luminous moments, hope and history rhyme. The unprecedented scale of forced displacement, its growing catalysts, and the distress darkening it present immediate challenges for migrants and marginalized people all over the world. The 6 lectures in this series by Calcutta Research Group explore the conditions of migrants in the present day. They investigate issues of protection, vulnerability, neoliberalism, statelessness, international law, and ethics. Lecture 3: Neoliberalism, Migrant Worker, and the Burden of the Epidemic. Few observations. The speakers are Arup Kumar Sen from Srirampur College and Iman Kumar Mitra from Shivnadar University. 4 interconnected themes shape the operation of migrant labor in the present day: the specificity of the neoliberal labor regime, the dichotomy of formal and informal labor spaces, the projected association between informality and migration, and the impact of the pandemic on these conceptions. Conflicts emerging from fragmented forms of labor call for a reorientation of politics towards justice and collective responsibility.
Hello and welcome everybody to the module Neoliberalism, Migrant Workers and the Burden of the Epidemic. So I'm Iman and I teach history in Shivnadar University. It is a university in Uttar Pradesh in India. And today we will be making a short presentation on the theme of the module. This module is jointly coordinated by me and Professor Arup Sen, whom we are going to meet in November when we will be meeting again for your presentations. But today we will be doing this theme lecture with the help of a PowerPoint presentation. So I will be sharing that PowerPoint and we will try to follow the PowerPoint. The problem, although it's not a big problem, but the thing is that we don't have too much time to talk about many of the issues that we will be discussing in that PowerPoint. So it will be a bit sketchy, and that's why I'm calling it few observations that I want to share with you. So again, we can have a lengthier discussion when we will have that live interaction. So without any delay, let me share the PowerPoint with you. The title of the presentation is, of course, Neoliberalism, Migrant Workers, and the Burden of the Epidemic. Few observations, as I mentioned, I'm calling it few observations because most of these observations will be a bit sketchy, but as I have told you that we can discuss about these things at length when we will meet in November or before, when we will have the live interaction. So the premise of this presentation, I have tried to, sort of talk about this thing in certain sections. The first section is called Neoliberalism and the concept of labor that it offers. The second section is this duality or distinction between the formal and the informal, formal labor, formal informal economy. Then in the third section, we will be talking about the connection between migration and informality. And in the last section, we will be coming to the point of the burden of the epidemic, the corona pandemic, which is happening right now. And so when we were preparing this module, the pandemic started, and we thought that it would be very useful to incorporate the idea or the way the epidemic or the pandemic is happening, because as you know that it has actually exposed the situation of the migrant workers in an unforeseen way, in a great way, and it has actually brought the question of the migrant worker to the center of the labor discourses all over the world, not only in India but all over the world. Now, so the first section in neoliberalism and labor, it is important actually to understand what is neo in neoliberalism, because most of the times we actually confuse neoliberalism with the classical liberalism of the 19th century or early 20th century. So it is important to have a clear idea about what we are actually talking about here. So one of the first things that we need to remember is that neoliberalism emerged between the wars, between the First World War and the Second World War and after, as sort of a critique of classical liberalism of the 19th century, socialism, Keynesianism, and fascism. And if you can, and as you know, that all these frameworks or all these worldviews have one thing in common: they are talking about, or they are offering, a theory of the state, each of them. So in classical liberalism, the state, there is sort of a separation between the economic sphere and the political sphere. And the state was supposed to be confined in the political sphere. The state was not supposed to intervene in the economic sphere. In socialism, as you know, the state owns all the resources and all the channels of distribution as well. So it is, again, it's kind of a statist thing in that sense. Keynesianism, of course, it has its own idea of the state, but the state will intervene in the demand side, and therefore it will generate employment, and it will create opportunity, consumption opportunities for people, which will lead to more production, and therefore the economy will be on the right track. And then fascism, of course, you are familiar, the state theory, the theory of the state in fascism, where the state is actually governed by a very strict regime of law, and where the state is actually determining the political sphere. And neoliberalism, it's interesting to understand that it emerged as a critique of all these theories of the state, and it has its own theory of the state. So first we need to remember that neoliberalism is not only an economic concept or an economic theory, it's also a political concept or a political theory. So just for a very brief sort of genealogy of neoliberalism, the intellectual genealogy of neoliberalism, in 1938, certain intellectuals in Paris assembled and had this Walter Lippmann, participated in this Walter Lippmann colloquium. Walter Lippmann was an American journalist and author who wrote a book called The Good Society a few years before. And there he criticized the classical idea of liberalism and said that the First World War actually quite resoundingly proved the failure of the classical model of liberalism, or the classical project of liberalism, that the idea of the state which was there, which was sustained by the classical ideas of liberalism, is not going to work anymore. So we need to think of the political, and we need to think of the relationship between the political and the economic in a different way. So Walter Lippmann was invited by certain French intellectuals in Paris in 1938, and they had this colloquium. And again, in that colloquium, there was a consensus that there needs to be some kind of a framework, some kind of an understanding, some kind of a worldview which will be different from all these existing theories of the state, be it the liberal theory of the state, or the socialist, or the Keynesian, or the fascist theory of the state. So, and then of course the Second World War started, which again convinced many of these people that there is a need to think of the role of the state in the political sphere as well as in the economic sphere in a different way. So in 1947, some of these intellectuals, led by this Austrian intellectual and economist who would later receive the Nobel Prize in economics, called Friedrich Hayek. And so they, in the Swiss town of Montpellier, they founded this Montpellier Society, and Friedrich Hayek remained the president of the Montpellier Society for the first 20 or 22 years of its existence, and later on also he participated in its activities. So the interesting story about both the Walter Lippmann Colloquium and the Montpellier Society is this, that one, this is happening in a very organized way. So the difference between, let's say, the 19th century classical liberal intellectual movement and the 20th century neoliberal movement is this: that in 20th century all these intellectuals are coming together and actually coming up with ideas in a very concerted, in a collective manner. Also, the second important thing, as I mentioned already, that they are interested in a theory of the state. But this theory of the state, this is how it is actually differing from classical liberalism. This theory of the state is not creating an autonomous sphere for the economic, or creating an autonomous sphere of the political separated from the economic. There is no separation between the economic and the political. Rather, their argument was that the state should be modeled, or state should be fashioned in a way that it follows the market. So this is, we need to remember very clearly when we start talking about neoliberalism, that this is the neo in neoliberalism, that this, I mean, going against the idea of liberalism, they are actually proposing certain kind of synergy between the state and the economy. And they are assuming some kind of priority of the market, that the market is prior to the state and the state will be modeled after the market. So it's a marketization of the state here we are talking about. In liberalism, by the way, the exchange activities, which are the characteristic of the economy, they are not to be touched by the state. They have to be left completely separate. They have to be left completely independent of any kind of state intervention. Here, the state is modeled by and after the market. So this thing, again, it's very sketchy right now, but if you want to have a longer discussion, we can have it later. But this very clear distinction, we need to remember that the state here now, there is a new theory of the state where the state here now is modeled after the market. So the state will have to listen to the market. The market is actually providing intelligence to the state. So along with this, certain other things are happening which are very important for our story as well, which is the foundation of the Bretton Woods, the conference that happened in 1944 in Bretton Woods, and which actually laid to the foundation of certain institutions which together we call the Bretton Woods institutions. Of course, the most famous of them are the United Nations, the IMF, World International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Now, again, there is a reason for confusion. It seems like, by the name at least, that the IMF is some kind of a fund or World Bank is some kind of a bank. Actually, it's the opposite. World Bank was created as a fund for reparation of all the countries which participated in the Second World War against the Axis power. And IMF is actually a bank which will be giving loans to all these countries for their development. Now, interesting thing, and it has been argued by many people, that with the Bretton Woods Conference, there is a shift in also the understanding of the world. There's a shift in the world view, the way the world is understood, the way the world is viewed. Is that there is a shift from the universal to the global. So again, we're not getting into the differences between the universal and the global. If you want, you can put it down and we can have this discussion later. But just for the time being, in a very sketchy way, the global actually characterizes a vast network, a vast worldwide network of certain institutions and their activities and their networks. And the global, thus envisaged, it exists as a connected, a particular entity where this connectedness, where this network becomes more important than the institutions, than the singular institutions themselves. So when we talk about IMF or when we talk about World Bank or when we talk about United Nations or various development banks which emerged after from the 1950s, we can't think of them actually in isolation. We have to think of them in terms of their locations within that network. And this is how this global network of neoliberalism started to operate, because again, all these Bretton Woods institutions, they started taking or appointing all these intellectuals who participated in the Walter Lippmann Colloquium or who were members of the Montpellier Society. And actually at one point the Chicago Department of Economics and Chicago law became flooded with these people, their presence, and so these people became the experts within the Bretton Woods institutions. And so from then on till this, and it sort of culminated in 1989 in the Washington Consensus, where these institutions together came together and actually produced a document which should be something that the less developed economies or the underdeveloped economies should follow. And of course, and as we know, as we have seen in the case of India, this document was taken very seriously in the 1991 economic reforms, and the era of LPG started, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And so in Washington Consensus, there was a consensus about, again, this concept of the state or the theory of the state, where the state was made to listen to the market. And the cry, the mantra of the market was privatization. So privatization of resources, and then all this forcing these countries into different kinds of mostly exploitative trade agreements with other countries. And through those trade agreements, again, a global network of institutions and activities and players started to emerge. So this is the framework within which we will be talking about the situation of the migrant workers and labor in general. So in order to do that, also we need to understand the concept of labor as envisaged or as envisioned by the neoliberal thinkers. So in 1961, a neoliberal economist, Gary Baker, who was also a member of the Mockery Society, wrote this book called Human Capital, which became again the primary conceptualization of labor in the neoliberal doctrine, and which actually led to formation of all these human resource departments in various companies and various organizations. So Gary Baker's theory of human capital actually focused on a very particular aspect of a person's upbringing, which are education and health. And as you can see, that these are the two frontiers, these are the two last frontiers of privatization as well, education and health. And Gary Baker's argument was that investment in education and health, actually these are investments in creation of the human skill or abilities. So these are the crux of their human skill. So the humanity of the labor is actually incumbent on their upbringing, education, and health, and therefore the state should not have any saying that. And again, in most countries, education and health were public sort of services, and the argument was that these education and health, which are investment, which are areas of investment on human labor, that should be taken away from the clutches of the state, and again that should be made to listen to the market. So Michel Foucault in 1979 gave a series of lectures called Birth of Biopolitics, where he discusses all these themes. So that is the primary text from where we are actually drawing the history of neoliberalism, its distinction from all the other theories of state and the concept of human capital. So in that series of lectures, Foucault says, seen from the side of the worker, labor is not a commodity reduced by abstraction to labor power and the time during which it is used. So this is the neoliberal idea of labor, which it's trying to differentiate from the classical liberal idea of labor, which is based on production. So, broken down in economics terms, Foucault says, from the worker's point of view, labor comprises a capital. That is to say, it is a machine, and on the other side, so that is to say, it is an ability, a skill, as the neoliberals say, it is a machine. And on the other side, it is an income, wage, or rather a set of wages, as they say, an earning stream. So this creation of ability through education and health, these aspects of upbringing, and creating these abilities or skills in such a way that the human labor will turn into some kind of a machine, and therefore it makes sense when you call them human capital, not labor. So the idea of labor, which had an ethical connotation as well in the 19th century, especially since Marx's intervention, that ethical dimension of labor is gone in the neoliberal theory. It disappears with this conceptualization of labor as some kind of capital, and investment in betterment of labor should be counted as investment in some kind of capital. So, with this framework of neoliberalism and its concept of labor in mind, we will progress into this distinction that emerges in the 1950s and 60s between the formal and the informal. And please try to remember that this distinction is also a product of this kind of neoliberal orientation of labor as capital. So the organization or the institution which plays again a very important role in that is ILO, or the International Labour Organization, although it existed before the Bretton Woods Conference, but after the Bretton Woods Conference it became part of the whole nexus or the network of these Bretton Woods institutions or the neoliberal institutions. So it has, again, we are not getting into the very complex or detailed history of that because of short of time, but it's just important to mention here that there is a very complex history involving the economic reason or the kind of intellectual prerogatives there were, the neoliberal intellectual reason or rationality, global institutions and statutory bodies like UN, World Bank, IMF, and ILO, and the post-colonial, post-World War II economy of aid, which ILO, United Nations, and different Asian development banks, African development banks, Latin American development banks have actually created. So it starts in the 1950s, immediately after the Second World War, riding on this riding on this willingness to have a new worldview. Also, we see birth of something called development economics through the writings of W. Arthur Lewis or Rostow, and Rostow's theories of stages of growth and all that. Again, we're not getting into that, but just we will be sharing the text with you so that it will be easier for you to grasp around it. Just try to take these things down so that when we will have the discussion, it will we can have sort of an exchange on this. So in the 1950s, we see birth of development economics through the Lewis model and models of Rostow, where Lewis is talking about this movement of labor from underdeveloped regions to the developed regions, which also actually gave birth to this distinction between the global north and the global south. It was expected that people will be moving from global south to global north, or even within the country, from less industrialized regions to more industrialized regions. So in that sense, Lewis' model is also offering a theory of migration or industrial migration. So in the 1960s, it was observed that the projected growth of modern industrial jobs, which would attract all these people, and the number of actual jobs created, there was a mismatch between that. So Lewis model and Rostow's stages of growth actually, gave a roadmap which seems to be faltering in the 1960s. So which led to some kind of a pessimistic undertones in post-Lewis development economics, and people started to think again of the ways how to bring the economy onto the track. And behind all these, I insist that this neoliberal understanding of labor is very important. So the movement of labor in this whole framework was thought as smooth as movement of capital. Again, riding on some of these ideas of conceptualizing labor as one aspect of capital. But it was seen that the movement of labor, there is a difference between the movement of labor and the movement of capital. Movement of labor is not as smooth as it was assumed. Migration has its own features. So therefore, all these new development economists who emerged in the 1960s, they started to focus on the theories of migration or movement of labor from a more pessimistic perspective. And they started to argue that there is some kind of a temporary condition between joblessness and employment which would exist before all this workforce who are moving from, let's say, the rural areas or from the south to the north, from the rural areas to the urban areas, from the less industrialized or agricultural areas to the industrial areas, or from the global south to global north, there will be a period of temporary unemployment and joblessness. So in that period, these people, they won't be completely appropriated by the industrial sector, but they will start to, they will, for some while, they will remain in what this guy, an economist of the post-Lewis development economics tradition, Todaro, he argues that they will belong to this urban traditional sector. What is this urban traditional sector? This urban traditional sector will later be renamed as the informal sector. And there, actually the role of ILO or International Labour Organization will be very important. So in 1961, looking again at this very pessimistic picture, ILO launches this World Employment Program, again taking all these economists and intellectuals and theorists from various quarters of neoliberal think tanks from all over the world, where the unemployment or joblessness, which was being observed everywhere, became the main focus of development of all these less developed countries or LDCs. So ILO started sending envoys of specialists to different LDCs in the name of employment mission. So some of these, again, economists later become very famous. Most of them in the 1960s, they were young and they just started to do research. By the 1980s and 90s, they will be getting the Nobel Prizes in economics and they will become very famous. One of them is Joseph Stiglitz, who went to Kenya as part of this Kenya mission in 1972 or before actually. So in 1972, ILO sends this envoy to Kenya, and in the report of that Kenya mission, actually for the first time we encountered the term informal, and they tried to conceptualize the term informal, which is previously known as the urban traditional sector. This temporary domain, this domain is sort of a twilight domain between the agricultural sector and the industrial sector. So what are the features of the informal as observed by the Kenya report? First of ease of entry. So in the industrial sector, the entry of the workforce which move from one place to another, the migrant workforce, it's very difficult. In case of the informal sector, the urban traditional sector, the Kenya report observes people can easily get an entry into that sector. Reliance on indigenous resources which are not owned by big capital, which are not owned by the industrialists, but resources which are smaller in quantity and which are indigenously owned, which are not owned by the global capitalist industrialist networks. Most of the enterprises which exist in this informal or traditional urban traditional economy, they are owned by their families. The operation scale of operation is small. They are labor intensive rather than capital intensive, and they use certain technologies. There is an adaptive nature of the technology that they use. They are easy to adopt, as well as they can change. They can change their technologies, and they can make swift changes in their technological compositions of capital. Skills acquired outside the formal school system, which means the formal school system is not enabling people to, it's not like you need to have a formal schooling to participate in this sector. Actually, skills acquired outside the formal school sector proves to be more important and significant, and then unregulated and competitive markets. So I would actually request you to focus on these 2 points: skills acquired outside the formal school system and unregulated and competitive markets. Already you can see that how neoliberal thinking is acting within the formulation of the neoliberal, of the informal. First of all, it is focused on this question of skill, which we have already seen in the neoliberal conceptualization of labor, that it's basically the way labor is conceptualized. It's kind of a capital where skill enhancement happens through education and health. So here also, while the ILO in their Kenya mission, they are trying to conceptualize the labor within the informal sector. They are focusing on these development of skills, enhancement of skills, but now they are observing that even beyond the formal school system, these skills can actually emerge. The other thing which actually made the informal very dear to these people, and they sort of embrace the idea of informal in full force and with great speed, is that the existence of, in their view, certain kind of unregulated and competitive markets. They saw that in case of big capital, in case of big industries, capital is most of the time frozen. The movement of labor is not smooth, as we have already observed. It's difficult for people to gain an entry. At the same time, movement of capital from one sector to another sector is also quite difficult. So therefore, they discovered as some kind of an antidote, some kind of antithesis to that sector, to the formal sector, which would be later called, again, as in comparison with the informal sector, that against the formal sector, in the informal sector, the movement of capital is also unregulated and sort of not unregulated, but it's easier. It's very easy to move capital from one sector to another sector within the informal economy, and then also the competitiveness of the informal market is very high in comparison with the competitiveness of the formal market. Now, these 2 points actually attracted a lot of people, not only as an intellectual exercise but also as a foundation of policies. And from now on, it was not really the the existence of the informal economy was not really looked at as some kind of a lab, but rather it was encouraged as some kind of subsidiary or an ancillary sector to the former. So people have argued after that, and we will share some of these texts for you to read and to get a sense of this. That without the informal sector, the formal sector can't operate because the formal sector has all these limitations. So even but in case of the informal sector, actually they have observed the the working of the neoliberal ideas or the conceptualization of the state within that framework where the policies will be based on again the competitiveness of the market or the unregulated movement of labor and capital, that will actually make more sense within the informal economy rather than within the formal economy. So from now on, we will see that this informal is encouraged in a way by the economists as some kind of not even secondary, but even in cases of most of the less developed countries or the underdeveloped economies, this was characterized as or this was defined as the chief characteristic of these economies, and the policies thus designed were not meant to eradicate the informal as it was the dream in the 1950s by the old development economists or the early days of development economics where the economists were trying to eradicate the agrarian or the non-industrial sector sort of and then appropriate all the workforce, at least the surplus workforce existing in the agrarian sector by the industrial sector. But then these people are saying this temporary, which was supposed to be temporary in the 1960s. Since the Kenya mission and discovery of the informal, that temporary was given sort of a priority and the temporary was allowed to continue ad infinitum. So now there are various ways this informal has been described by thinkers or economists or political theorists who do not subscribe to the neoliberal thinking. Two of them, again, there are many, but for the shortage of time, we will be mentioning only two of them. One is Jan Bremon's idea of footloose labor, which again it's described in this book called Working in India's Informal Economy, which was published in 1996, where Jan Bremen is arguing, again going against this history of this history of creation of the informal, is that informal is not the abnormal other of the formal. The formal was born after legal interventions by the colonial government, and he's talking in case of the colony. The informal, defined as footloose, does not enjoy legal contractual safeguards. So first of all, Jan Bremen makes this distinction between the formal and the informal in terms of existence of certain contracts. So in the formal economy, we can see that there are labor rights, there are some kind of a contract between the employed and the employee. In the informal sector, there is an absence of legal contractual safeguards like that. But then Jan Bremen is arguing it will be wrong to assume that the informal is following the formal, that informal is the other of the formal. It's rather the opposite. So in most of the colonies, which later became after decolonization the less developed countries, on which like Kenya, on which these economists were theorizing, so he was saying in most of these countries, the there was no existence of the formal in that sense before. It was rather what was later known as the informal, which existed in case of the lack of the legal contracts. But then, obviously, when this formalization started to happen, this informal became certain kind of an other, an abnormal other to the former. Now there is a limitation with this argument, as you can see, that it also actually, even though it tries to criticize or challenge the genealogy of the creation of the informal, but at the same time it doesn't actually, it assumes this distinction, and it sort of, in a way, it nourishes that distinction, it sustains that distinction by making the informal as the site where there is a lack or absence of legal or contractual safeguards. So from since young Bremen, there is among, especially among the left, especially among the left intellectuals, there is this tendency to define the formal and the informal in terms of absence of legal rights of the laborers. We will come to that point. Then, more recently, Guy Standing introduced this concept of the precariat, the new dangerous class, in 2011 in this book called The New Dangerous Class, published in 2011. So, Guy Standing is introducing the concept of the precariat against the concept of the proletariat. So the difference between the precariat and the proletariat is that proletariat, the concept of the proletariat was based on collectivization of the workforces. The proletariat would emerge as sort of a unified collective mass of workers. On the other hand, Guy Standing is saying that the precariat exists, which is a product of flexibilization of labor laws under neoliberalism and globalization. So it is in a way of sort of reorienting or redefining the informal. And then this precariat, it's living in precarious conditions and born out of fragmentation of class structures. So on the other hand, whereas the proletariat is a solidified mass of the class of the workers belonging, a solidified mass across class structures. On the other hand, the precariat is actually fragmented. It's an effect of the fragmentation of the class structures. So, as you can see, again, in Guy Standing's idea of precariat, where the informal, and this is actually the closest to which we can sort of situate our own understanding of the informal, although he's not talking about the history or the genealogy of the informal in the way that we are talking about. But there is a sense that the precariat could only exist under neoliberalism and globalization, and it is an offshoot of the global network of neoliberal ideas and institutions and activities that we have been talking about. Now, so Tom Burns, and we will share this book with you, Making Cars in the New India is one example, which was published in 2018, where this precariat was studied in great detail from the perspective of this fragmentation, or what kind of conflicts that could arise from this fragmentation of the workforce, which was happening in this conceptual framework of precariat labor. So Tom Burns discusses how different forms of conflict have shaped industrial development in India, especially in the automobile industry. But these features can be observed in other industries as well. So these forms of conflict include commercial conflict between firms, which means competition, some kind of competition, market-like competition, industrial conflict between employers and workers, and biggest examples, Tom Burns himself gives examples of the conflict that happened in the Maruti factory in Manesar. And then the social conflict between groups of workers from different regions and different castes. Again, he discusses that in great detail while he was studying all these conflicts which happened in the automobile industry in the recent times. Institutional conflict involving labor market intermediaries like the contractors and trade unions, and the political conflict between firms, workers, and state institutions. Here you can also see Tom Barnes is also making an argument, assuming this distinction between the formal and the informal, and this the informal is characterized like in the fashion of both Jan Bremen and Guy Standing, that the informal is defined as this domain where the contractual agreements don't exist. Therefore, it is easier for the employers to exploit. And again, Tom wants most of this. If you take all these studies together, you will see that the migrant workers the migrant workers have a very big role in understanding of these, because, for example, the migrant workers who are moving from the villages to the cities, they have to live under precarious conditions. Again, young women's understanding of footloose labor, as it's evident from the name itself, there is constant mobility, that they are footloose and they are constantly mobile. So this workforce that they're talking about, the workforce which constitutes the majority of the informal sector, they are migrating from one part of the country to the other parts of the country, mostly from what they will argue from less developed parts of the country to the more or apparently more developed parts of the country. Now, the Arjun Sengupta Commission, which was actually built to look into the informal sector in 2007, when it was published its report in 2007, it actually characterizes the migrant workers within this discourse of the informal. So migrant workers are mostly those who are driven from their homes in search of means of earning a livelihood, lacking any skills and assets. They tend to end up in the unorganized sector, both in rural and urban areas. Such laborers are often sourced by labor brokers. More often than not, they end up in rural areas as farm laborers, and construction workers or rickshawalas or street vendors in urban areas. So you can see from here also we can get a very clear picture, and I would request you to go through the Arjun Gupta Commission report in great detail, because it's a fascinating report. And also, if within coming from this framework, you will see how even within that report, which is quite sympathetic to the situations of the workers, it is also actually subscribing to some of these distinctions which are created by, in a way, of this neoliberal framework. So even the Arjun Gupta Commission, which is a critique, which tries to produce a critique of the neoliberal thinking, it has to operate within that thinking. So penetrative and so greatly influential this framework is. Without this framework, it's almost impossible, because this framework gives us this distinction between the formal and the informal, and by locating the migrant workers within the informal domain, and by characterizing the informal domain as the site where the migrant workers will flock in big numbers, we are actually trying to, in a way, we are sort of subscribing and sustaining this framework in a way. So we will come towards the end of the presentation, we will come to the point how we can look beyond that framework. But just before that, let us have a sense of the migration situation in India, and which is given by the census of 2011. And we need to remember this is data from at least 10 years before, because the enumeration happened before 2011, it's 2020, and the census data, the D tables, were published only last year. So it's already quite late, and these numbers have been inflated in a huge way. And this is mostly migration in India, where people are moving from rural area within the state or urban area within the state, and from rural area outside the state and urban area outside the state. So as you can see, the movement within the state is huge. And this is not the entire account of migration, because again, a huge amount of migration happens because of marriage and other issues. We are just talking about migration where people migrated for work or employment. So in that case, even by this very conservative estimate, you can see the huge number of people who are actually moving, even within the country, who are moving from one place to another in search for jobs. Now, this again is a very conservative estimate, and we shouldn't take, like, because in this estimate, actually the percentage of migrant workers in India is abnormally low. It can't be the case. So, but even then, just try to think, from what you have been seeing or what you have been hearing about the situation of the migrant workers during the pandemic. If all these people start to move, if all these people start to move from their place of work to the place of their living, what kind of situation we are actually witnessing, or what kind of situation we might witness as well as in future. In 2020, this year, after the epidemic happened, CRG would publish this very interesting text called "Burdens of the Epidemic," which is compiled and edited by Professor Shamata. And we have actually come to the last segment of our presentation about the burden of the epidemic. And This text actually gives us some ideas, or it gives us some kind of an outline of how to think of the situation of the migrant worker beyond the structures or beyond the conceptual framework that we have talked about so far. Because again, as we have observed so far, that in that structure, there is a theory of the state, there is a theory of the neoliberal state, which is sort of subservient to the market, and then there is this understanding of labor as some kind of capital, some kind of an ability machine within the neoliberal framework, and then there is this distinction between the formal and the informal, where the boundary of the formal is created by the informal. The formal exists as sometimes as some kind of an abnormal other of the formal, or sometimes as the source of resources for the formal. But again, it has been heavily exploited in relation to the formal, which may not be the case, because the formal can also have as much exploitation as the informal is experiencing. So, in a way, in order to think of the situation of the migrant worker in the time of an epidemic, and the epidemic is exposing the situation of the migrant workers, again, as we have said, in an unforeseen way and in an unprecedented way. So, if we want to rethink the question of the migrant worker in the time of an epidemic, then probably we need to go beyond these frameworks. So far, the representation of the migrant workers in popular media as well as in some kind of conceptual work, we see that there is a narrative of plight and right. So people are talking about curbing of labor rights, which are happening in most of the states. The state that I am living in right now, Uttar Pradesh, it actually started with this curbing of labor rights, and there is a talk of extending the working hours from 8 hours to 12 hours. Also in Madhya Pradesh and other states, in Rajasthan, the curbing of labor rights happened. Then unplanned lockdown created a huge problem for people who lost their jobs, because there's this unprecedented joblessness. People are closing their businesses, and again, as some people have observed, that the informal sector is getting more affected by that. So unplanned lockdown actually led to unprecedented joblessness. And again, when we talk about workers in the informal sector, there is this, like in the absence of certain safeguards, we also see absence of health and other securities. So this narrative of plight and right, it foregrounds the plight of the migrant workers, and this foregrounding happens through this discourse of absence of right. Again, as you can see that there is a very straight line which is drawn here. From the informal sector, is the informal sector is defined as the domain where there is this absence of labor rights, and therefore all the people who are actually going through the plight are actually more are being more affected by that. Now, so Ronald Shivnadar in this Gardens of an Epidemic, in this text, raises a very interesting question. He says, he asks, will a rights-based approach to defend the existing entitlements workers be enough? Or is there now an overwhelming need to centrally situate the issue of informal workers, of whom a significant section belongs to migrant population? So first of all, Ravi Shankar is asking this question. Again, we are not going to respond to this question, but rather we will try to think along with him, and we will encourage you to also think along with him, that a rights-based approach to defend the existing entitlements of workers is actually, again, it bypasses the question of migration or mobility, because as we can see that this distinction which exists between the formal and the informal, where the informal is the abnormal other of the formal, it is always centered around the formal, as if formalization of the workforce will solve all the problems, as if the migrant workers were incorporated or appropriated by the industrial sector, by the formal industrial sector, then all of their problems would be solved. That may not be the case, especially facing the epidemic. So, Ravi Shamadar is trying to express this sort of urgency that there is a need to situate the issue of the informal workers centrally in the entire discourse, of which a significant section belongs to the migrant population. Now, in which way can we bring the so-called informal into the center of the discourse of labor, but not only the discourse of labor, as we will see in the text, in the discourse of life in general, because this epidemic is not only threatening to somebody's employment or entitlement, but it's also threatening, it's a life-threatening situation that we're living in right now. So the question of life and the question of labor need to be thought together. So this distinction between the formal and informal, and the way we have tried to historicize the distinction, it may not work in the sense that it will never allow the informal to come to the center, because it will always be conceptualizing the informal belonging to the margin. So, in order to bring the informal back to the center of the discourse, first I think we need to unlearn this distinction. At least we need to historicize this distinction. We need to understand the sort of artificiality of this distinction which exists. And then, along again, sort of, if we continue this rethinking, Schumacher suggests in a very provocative way of this return of the political from a discourse of plight to a struggle for justice. Now, what kind of justice can we think about? So, this is a struggle, this is a kind of justice which goes beyond this discourse of right, because again, these right-based discourses are focused primarily on the formal sector. So this justice, which is a more comprehensive idea of justice, calls for recognition of vulnerabilities and the daily struggles of, in this case, the migrant workers, and thus the call for a caring society and a caring state. This is a very important idea, and we will come to that point in the next slide. This concept of the caring state. So the mark of a caring state is that it shades its demeanor of negligence and replaces it with trust and compassion. The conduct of a caring state acquires an ethical tone, the care of the collective self, premised on a new politics of responsibility. Now, I would request you to go through this document very carefully and minutely to have a sense of this caring state that Shivnadar is trying to argue. But we will come to certain points that we have found very interesting in this context. But just to remind you, this, in a way, again, is bringing to us this concept of the state and the theory of the state which neoliberalism is offering. So, as you can see, that in order to talk about the situation of the migrant workers, we need to reconceptualize the state, we need to produce a critique of the neoliberal conception of the state. And in that sense, this has always been a political project, and this will always be a political project. There is only a political critique of neoliberalism which can exist, because neoliberalism in itself is not an economic project, it's a political project. So this is the last slide of the presentation. We have taken a lot of time. So in this, we are in the last, in the final slide, we will try to, point out again very sketchily certain distinctions between the caring state and between the caring state and the neoliberal state. So first of all, this distinction between the punitive state and the caring state. And Shamatka talks about the punitive state, which he takes from Foucault in a great way, and in the document. So I would request you to go through the document, and we can have this discussion later when we will meet. That so far the approach to the migrant workers and movement of people from one place to another during the pandemic is approached by the state in a punitive manner. All these isolation, all these creation of camps and all that, it signals kind of a punitive attitude to the people who are moving from one place to another. Rather than punitive, the state is supposed to be more caring, more compassionate, more sympathetic, more understanding, and should have better understanding of the situation of the people. Also, reorientation of the public, which can happen through the discourses of public health, which is very important in time of the epidemic, as well as the participation of the migrant workforce in the public discourse of life, which is a very important story. So it's the so how life is conducted in general. The migrant workers after the pandemic is actually sort of claiming some kind of position within that discourse as well. So the migrant workers are not just, it ceases to remain as a discourse of, as an economic discourse or as a discourse of the development activities, etc. So the migrant workers are now emerging as a life force which cannot be, which cannot be neglected anymore, because even within the official discourses, the migrant workers are envisaged as some kind of a threat to public life and public health. So already through the background, the migrant workers have become a part of this discourse. Now the emphasis, now the impetus that we have is to take the advantage of that situation and bring the question of the migrant workers more central to the public discourse of life. So therefore we come to the third point, the life of labor and the labor of life. So therefore it can only happen, this reorientation of the public can only happen when we make connection between the life of labor, how the laborers are living, and the labor of life, and what kind of life is being constituted by the labor that we see around us, but also we don't see. We kind of neglect, we kind of forget to look at them. So that again, in a very, I'm being very sketchy here, and just because again I'm just sort of throwing these concepts almost on your face in order to think through, and therefore when we come together we can discuss about them in more detail. And lastly, the politics of return. This is a return of the political, as well as there is a politics of return which is exposing all these questions, which is exposing all the problems with the system, with the establishment, with the framework that we're living in, that we're thinking through, that the way we are conceptualizing or trying to conceptualize labor or migration or migrant workers and their situation. So this politics of return is also returning to certain themes, certain ideas, returning to this notion of care, to this notion uh, of, of life, and how life and labor are conjoined, and how the epidemic has given us this opportunity to think through some of these ideas. So, in a way, this caring state is a very, it's a fascinating idea which can be pitted against this concept of neoliberal state, which of course is uncaring, and not only uncaring, it is dismissive of this idea of care or compassion, of this idea of sympathy, because it believes in, or because it turns labor into some kind of an ability machine, because it doesn't, it takes it, although it insists on the enhancement of human skills, it actually abstracts the human from the skill and creates this undifferentiable amalgamated mass of labor or human capital. So we need to intervene in that only by making intervention, in my opinion, along these axes. So anyway, that sort of brings us to the end of the presentation. And so since there is no since there is no chance of having an interaction right now, I think I will end the session right now. And it's almost been an hour. I'm supposed to speak for only 35 minutes and 40 minutes. I've taken 20 minutes extra of your time. So I apologize for that. And also I apologize if there is any lack of clarity or confusion in my presentation. I hope that we can have longer discussions after this session when we will meet in November, or even after that when we can have sort of an interaction or live chat, something like that. So until then, let me say goodbye and have a nice day and stay safe. And I want to thank CRG for this opportunity to talk about some of these issues which are quite dear to me as well. And I thank from on behalf of Professor Auruksen as well, who has been constant support in preparing this presentation. And okay, see you in some time.